everybody. It's Emily Grant and Dr. Maureen Frank, and are joining us today on our Cup Chat is our special guest, Brian Koch. And now, Brian has been a member of the Birding with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension team since the beginning. You want to give a quick, short introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I grew up birding in Southwest Texas, in Kinney County. And since then, I graduated college from Texas A&M, and I've done work with a couple of different environmental consulting companies. And now I'm a full-time birding tour guide based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And so we're so lucky to have Brian on our team. And so thanks for joining us for Cup Chat this morning. We host these almost every Wednesday morning at 7:30 on our Birding with Extension page. So if you haven't gone to like us, make sure you like us over there. And we usually start off the day with a free commercial. And free commercials are commercials about anything Brian or Maureen want to talk about or what they want to share with you that they didn't have to pay for. So Brian, you want to give us a free 30-second commercial about what you're loving about Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service and birding?
Sure. So I am super excited and looking forward to Birding the Border coming up in April of 2021. And that experience is going to be pretty amazing and incredible, and you won't want to miss it. We're going to be looking for birds like varied buntings and tropical parulas and green jays and golden cheek warblers, and in this really cool place where all these different ecoregions meet up. So it's one of my favorite events to guide for, and I'm super looking forward to being back with Extension in Texas.
Dr. Frank, what is your 30-second commercial going to be about today?
Mine is going to be for Learn to Bird, which is a new program that we're doing for the first time this October that's really focused for beginning birders to get some hands-on quality time in a relatively small group about learning to bird, the basics of birding. And we are super excited because Brian's going to be guiding with us for that as well. And so we'll have him there, and he's great with all levels of birders. So even if you are a beginner, it's a great kind of crash course on everything. Now, fall is not as much of a hotspot for number of species as spring, but we actually really like that for a beginning birding course because you're not just overwhelmed with such a huge number. And instead, we'll get to see some species that we just really get to take some time and look at and learn, okay, why did we say that was what we said it was? We'll be at the McKenna Ranch, which is a really cool property and has some fun species like screech owls. Last time we were there, we got to see a western and an eastern screech owl. No guarantee of that, but that's a fun one to learn about identification differences. And we will have a specific night where we go out and go owling and try to find those species.
Well, you took my free 15-second commercial because I was going to talk about how awesome, yesterday being International Owl Appreciation Day, I was going to talk about how cool it is that at both of our in-person programs coming up that we feature going owling at least for part of the program. So anyways, today on Cup Chat, we are going to be talking about molting. And molting is a very complex, complicated topic, and we're going to dive into it today as much as we can in our 15-minute Cup Chat. For those of you who don't know, molting is just simply the process when birds swap out their old worn feathers for a fresh new set. So over time, those feathers get worn and naturally tethered, and birds don't need them, so they slough them off. But one thing, Maureen, you've got a bunch of calls about is bald cardinals, and that's part of the molting process. You want to kind of give us a quick what is a bald cardinal and why are they okay?
Yeah, so we'll talk about the different types of molts, but I think the main thing that I wanted to mention here is that if you see a bird that is missing a bunch of feathers, usually it's a totally natural process that they're going through. There can be other things that cause birds to lose feathers, such as ectoparasites, so like mites and things that might be causing feather loss. But most of the time, like bald cardinals, they look really strange, but it's a totally natural process.
And Brian, let's talk a little bit, what is it that's actually causing these birds' feathers to wear out and causing them to molt in the first place?
Sure. So basically, in a bird's life, everything that it does can cause feather wear. So that includes preening, just flying around, UV exposure from the sun, taking a bath, brushing up against foliage, all these things can cause feather wear.
Well, and that's kind of funny, and this may be too much information for everybody out there, but way too much. I mean, I have to go off script just a smidge here. So when you said that, you know what I think about is like how all the time we lose our hair. Like just 24/7, like if you looked in the shower after I shower, it may look like I'm going bald. This beautiful long locks of red hair seems to just want to fall out. And so that makes me think about, like, when you talked about flying or preening, all those things, just and this may be too sciencey, but the friction of doing those things really can just like your hair, it just needs to be replaced. So
Exactly.
Funny. Fun fact. And now everybody knows that I had to lose a lot of hair in the shower. So now, a lot of times we consider molting to go with a certain time of year, and the lighting changes. Is there any other rhyme or reason for when birds decide to molt their feathers? Or is it really that timing? Or can they do it all year? What's kind of their timeline process, Maureen?
Yeah, so molt is very strategic, but it's also varies greatly depending on the individual species. There's as far as how often they molt and when exactly they molt. But it is related to the changing seasons, and both the timing of it and when it's right about to go is determined by hormones that the birds are releasing. And again, this is in response to the changing seasons. It's not something that we understand 100%. There's a lot of research still being done on how kind of the physiology of how everything works. But basically, one of the reasons that it'll happen for those different seasons, for example, is birds molting to a new color or pattern based on the season. So a good example of that is like ptarmigan. It's similar to kind of, if you know about snowshoe hares, is a mammal example that they'll be brown in the summer and white in the winter so they can blend in with their surroundings. There's ptarmigan that will do that. They'll be a brown color in the summer and they'll be white in the winter. So that can be to hide from predators, but then also birds will change their colors to try to attract a mate, right? So when it's not mating season, they don't need to be quite as flashy as when it is mating season. Yes, exactly.
Right.
Brian, you got anything to add?
Sure. So on top of that, molting the feathers of the birds it takes a lot of energy to do that. So as far as the time of year goes, when they use that strategy as far as when they're going to do that, they don't want to overlap molt with other things that are also energetically expensive. So raising your young, finding a mate, migrating thousands of miles. They don't want to be molting while they're doing that. So typically molt is done shortly before and after the breeding season.
So right now, we're doing lots of molting now.
Right. So a lot of birds are starting to molt right now as they're preparing to migrate back to their wintering grounds. So they're done, they've raised their young, and now they're going to molt a new set of feathers and have their winter plumage. So that winter plumage we would call their basic plumage. And in the breeding season, they're going to molt into their alternate plumage. So even if you look at just the birds in your backyard, you can see this molt happening. So right now they're going to look really tattered, worn out, kind of scruffy looking. But in a few months, they're going to look really fresh and nice.
Well, and that's interesting as we talk about time of year and in the migration. A lot of, we think some of that has to do with temperature, but a lot of, especially in the livestock world, because a lot of y'all know I have a livestock background, but a lot of things within the livestock background doesn't necessarily pinpoint to temperature in terms of season, but it pinpoints into the length of the hours of daylight. And so that can also be something to think about when we think about seasons. Don't always just equate with temperature, but also the hours and periods of daylight can really affect some of these things as well. But really, why are we talking about molting, and why is this important, an important topic, and why do we just say birds molt, we don't really care, see you next spring?
Right. Okay. So for birders, like you said, you might think, okay, sometimes they're ratty, sometimes they're really crisp looking. So what does it matter? Why should I care about all these details?
Just don't take a picture of the ratty birds.
Right. but a little bit deeper than that. Molt can tell us about a bird's age, sex, and even more. So some very similar looking species molt their feathers at different times of year, and we can use that as a tool to identify them. So one example would be common nighthawk versus lesser nighthawk, and that's an ID problem that we would have in South Texas. These two species are usually encountered at dusk when they're flying around, so the viewing conditions are not always optimal, and the ID points that you would typically use are really subjective, kind of hard to see. You kind of need ideal conditions. But if they're molting, if you see one that's missing a bunch of wing feathers, you would automatically know that's a lesser nighthawk because they molt their wing feathers starting in June, whereas common nighthawks won't molt those feathers until winter when they get onto their non-breeding wintering grounds. So if you see something that's all molty, you know it's lesser. If it's not, you know it's common.
So understanding the process of molting can really help us in our identification, especially in those tricky times, or when they're molting. Understanding that a bird is molting would be very crucial if you were trying to identify it. So basically, identification is a big reason we'd want to understand molting in the process.
Right.
Yeah, and this is also important too because so in addition to what the adults are doing, going from basic to alternate, there's juvenile plumage as well. So a lot of our species are going to look different as juveniles from when they're adults. And in a lot of species, it's pretty quick, right? So they've just got that juvenile plumage for a little while. But in other species, it takes longer. And so an example of this with eagles is that juvenile bald eagles are sometimes confused to be golden eagles because they don't get that white head until 5 years later when they're putting on their adult plumage. So when you consider that we've got basic and alternate for juvenile and adults and all those different plumages for just one species, you can see why this is a complicated topic and why the better we understand kind of what to expect from the bird's molt, the better we can identify them and just helping be kind of a better birder and figuring out some of those little bit tricky identification puzzles. One more thing that I just want people to know about molting is that birds, again, different species are going to do this differently, but they're strategic about how their individual feathers molt. And so I also just wanted to bring this back to the whole shedding your hair thing, because I totally think about that too, Emily. Like, we're losing hair all the time.
Now, if you think about after the shower, people would think I was bald.
But you would think about, like, on a bird, so, like, what purpose does our hair serve? Like, our head hair is not a huge deal. Like, aesthetically, I have no desire to be bald.
It is a huge deal.
Okay, it's a huge deal.
I am not okay with being
Emily will die without her hair, but most of us, if Brian went bald tomorrow, he probably wouldn't die. And so, but on birds, it's a little bit, on birds, it's a little bit different. Their body feathers are important for warmth. So in the summer, you're like, might not matter as much, but some of those body feathers are going to be important for keeping warm. But the feathers on their wings are what helps them fly. And so for a lot of species, they're going to be shedding those flight feathers symmetrically and maybe only a few at a time. And so this is why, like, this time of year, sometimes you'll look up and see a vulture and you kind of see his wings that are like fingers, and there might be like one kind of missing. You can see like a little dip, and there's just a couple that are being replaced, and you might see that on both sides. But they are only losing a couple at a time so that they can retain the ability to fly. There's other species though, so waterfowl are an example of this. Some waterfowl, and then my dissertation research was on eared grebes at Great Salt Lake. They're going to molt all their flight feathers at once, and so they can't fly during that short period of time. But the reason that we see that, like in waterfowl as opposed to songbirds, is because they can still get their food and their shelter while they're on the surface of the water. Obviously, it's a little more risk, from predators, but again, they can kind of get away from predators being in the center of the water, as opposed to, if it's something like a tanager and they couldn't fly for a week or two, that would be really bad. They wouldn't be able to go get food. They wouldn't be able to escape from predators, and that's an issue. So that was just one more thing that I wanted to mention.
Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us on Cut Chat. If you want to bird with Brian, make sure you check him out on Instagram, as well as come to Birding the Border or Learn to Bird, because he is one of our guides. You're guiding one day at Fort Clark Springs, which is where you grew up, and you started learning to bird. And Fort Clark Springs is amazing. It's what's the name of the spring that comes up?
Los Morris Springs.
Morris.
The Los Morris Springs run through Fort Clark. It is a gorgeous property in Kinney County.
And I will say also that trip routinely gets the biggest biggest day list of pretty much all of our trips.
So if you are interested in birding with Brian, make sure you check that out. We have a whole host of other guides And make sure you check out our website to find those out. So thanks, everybody. We hope you have a great Wednesday, and thanks for joining us for Cup Chat. Bye.